The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of Manhattan, New York City, on Saturday, March the 25th, 1911, was the deadliest industrial fire in the history of the city and one of the deadliest in America's history. The fire caused the deaths of 146 garment workers, 123 women and girls, and 23 men who died from the fire, smoke inhalation, falling, or simply jumping to their deaths. Most of the victims were recent Italian or Jewish immigrant women and girls between the ages of 14 and 23. Of the victims whose ages are known, the oldest was 43-year-old Providenza Panno, and the youngest was 14-year-old Kate Leone and Rosaria Sara, Maltese. Because the doors to the stairwells and exits were locked, a common practice at the time to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks and to reduce theft. Many of the workers could not escape from the burning buildings and simply jumped from the high-rise windows. There were no water sprinklers in the building. The fire led to legislation requiring improved factory safety standards and helped to spur the growth of the International Ladies Garments Workers Union, which fought for better working conditions for sweatshop workers. The Triangle Waste Company factory occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the 10-story ash building on the northwest corner of Green Street and Washington Place, just east of Washington Square Park in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City. Under the ownership of Max Blanc and Isaac Harris, the factory produced women's blouses known as shirtwaists. The factory normally employed about 500 workers, mostly young Italian and Jewish immigrant women and girls, who normally worked 9 hours a day on weekdays plus 7 hours on Saturdays, earning for their 52 hours of work between 7 and 12 United States dollars weekly. At approximately 4:40 p.m. on Saturday, March the 25th, 1911, as the workday was ending, a fire flared up in a scrap bin under one of the cutters' tables at the northeast corner of the 8th floor. The first fire alarm was sent at 4:45 p.m. by a passerby on Washington Place who saw smoke coming from the 8th floor. Both owners of the factory were in attendance and had invited their children to the factory on that specific afternoon. The fire marshal concluded that the likely cause of the fire was the disposal of an unextinguished match or cigarette butt in a scrap bin containing 2 months' worth of accumulated cuttings. Beneath the table in the wooden bin were hundreds of pounds of scraps left over from the several thousand shirtwaists that had been cut at the table. The scraps piled up from the last time the bin was emptied, coupled with the hanging fabrics that surrounded. The steel trim was the only thing that was not highly flammable. Although smoking was banned in the factory, workers were known to sneak cigarettes, exhaling the smoke through their lapels to avoid detection. A New York Times article suggested that the fire had been started by the engines running the sewing machines. A series of articles in Collier's notepad noted that a pattern of arson among certain sectors of the garment industry whenever their particular product fell out of fashion or had excess inventory in order to collect insurance. The Insurance Monitor, a leading industry journal, observed that shirtwaists had recently fallen out of fashion and that insurance for manufacturers of them was fairly saturated with moral hazard. Although Blanc and Harris were known for having had 4 previous suspicious fires at their companies, the arson was not suspected in this particular case. A bookkeeper on the 8th floor was able to warn employees on the 10th floor by way of telephone, but there was no audible alarm and no way to contact staff on the 9th floor. According to survivor Yetta Lubitz, the first warning of the fire on the 9th floor arrived at the same time as the fire itself. Although the floor had a number of exits, including 2 freight elevators, a fire escape, and stairways down to Green Street and Washington Place, flames prevented workers from descending the Green Street stairway, and the door to the Washington Place stairway was locked to prevent theft by the workers. The locked doors allowed managers to check the woman's purse. Various historians have also ascribed the exit doors being locked to the management's wanting to keep out union organizers due to management's anti-union bias. The foreman who held the stairway door key had already escaped by another route. Dozens of employees escaped the fire by going up the Green Street stairway to the roof. Other survivors were able to jam themselves into the elevators while they continued to separate. Within just under 3 minutes, the Green Street stairway became unusable in both directions. Terrified employees crowded into the single exterior fire escape, which city officials had allowed Ash to erect instead of the required 3rd staircase, a flimsy and poorly anchored iron structure that may have been broken before the fire. It soon twisted and collapsed from the heat and overload, spilling about 20 victims nearly 100 feet to their deaths on the concrete pavement below. The remainder waited until smoke and fire overcame their bodies. The fire department arrived quickly, but they were unable to stop the flames, as their ladders were only long enough to reach as high as the 7th floor of the building. The fallen bodies and fallen victims also made it difficult for the fire department to approach the building. Elevator operators Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortellaro saved many lives by traveling 3 times up to the 9th floor for passengers, but Mortellaro was eventually forced to give up when the rails of his elevator buckled under the drastic heat. Some victims pried the elevator doors open and jumped into the empty shaft, trying to slide down the cables or to land on top of the elevator car. The weight and impacts of these bodies warped the elevator car and made it impossible for Zito to make another attempt. William Gunn Shepherd, a reporter at the tragedy, said that he learned a new sound that day, a sound more horrible than description can picture: the thud of a speeding living body on a stone sidewalk. A large crowd of bystanders gathered on the street, witnessing 62 people jumping or falling to their deaths from the burning building. Although early references of the death toll ranged from 14 to 148, almost all modern references agreed that 146 people died as a result of the fire, 123 women and girls, and 23 men. Most victims died of burns, asphyxiation, blunt impact injuries, or a combination of all 3. The first person to jump was a man, and another man was seen kissing a young woman at the window before they both leapt to their deaths. Bodies of the victims were taken to Charities Pier, located at 26th Street and the East River for identification by relatives and families and friends. Victims were interred in 16 different cemeteries. 22 victims of the fire were buried by the Hebrew Free Burial Association in a special section at Mount Richmond Cemetery. In some instances, their tombstones refer to the fire. 6 victims remain unidentified until Michael Hirsch, a historian, completed 4 years of researching paper articles and other searches for missing persons, and he was able to identify each of these victims. Those 6 victims were buried together in the cemetery of the Evergreens in Brooklyn. Originally interred elsewhere on the grounds, these people's remains now lie beneath a monument to the tragedy, which is a large marble slab featuring a kneeling woman. The company's owners, Max Blanc and Isaac Harris, who were both Jewish immigrants who survived the fire by fleeing to the building's roof when it began, were indicted on charges of first and second degree manslaughter in mid-April. The pair's trial began on December the 4th, 1911. Maxter, counsel for the defendants, managed to destroy the credibility of one of the survivors, Kate Alterman, by asking her to repeat her testimony a number of times, which she did without altering key phrases. Maxter argued to the jury that Alterman and possibly other witnesses had memorized their statements and might even have been told what to say by the prosecutors. The prosecution charged that the owners knew the exit doors were all locked at the time of the fire. Investigations found that the locks were intended to be locked during working hours based on the findings from the fire, but the defense stressed that the prosecution failed to prove that the owners knew that. The jury acquitted the 2 men of first and second degree manslaughter, but they were both found liable of wrongful death during a subsequent civil suit in 1913, in which plaintiffs were awarded compensation in the amount of $75 per deceased victim. The insurance company paid Blanc and Harris about $60,000 more than the reported losses, or about $400 per casualty. The last living survivor of the fire was Rose Friedman, who died in Beverly Hills, California on February 15, 2001, at the ripe age of 107. She was 2 days away from her 18th birthday at the time of the fire, which she survived by following the company's executives and being rescued from the roof of the building. As a result of her experience, she became a lifelong supporter of unions. On September the 16th, 2019, U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren delivered a speech in Washington Square Park, supporting her presidential campaign, a few blocks away from the location of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Senator Warren recounted the story of the fire and its legacy before a crowd of supporters, likening activism for workers' rights following the 1911 fire to her own presidential platform. So this was the story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire.